Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming to View Studios for our little presentation of aperture lighting in a volume. So for a couple of ground rules, I think. Anybody has a question anytime, feel free to shout it out. We will do a Q&A after this at 6 o'clock with Andrew Fish, editor of something at American Cinematographer, and Richard Crudo, ASC. So you can save questions for later, but it might be better in the moment to shout them out before we get too deep, because we're going to cover a lot of ground here. So I'm not really sure who signed up to come to this thing to see me, because I don't know anybody who wants to listen to me talk for 2 hours, but I want to find out about all of you all. So has anyone here worked on an LED volume before? Okay, cool. Has anyone here worked just with LED walls? Okay. Has anyone, who's a DP? A director? Camera assistants? Producers? Operators? Editors? Okay, cool. All right, cool. So then I think we'll talk generally about volumes and how they work, but specifically with lighting. But I can go as deep or as shallow as we want into how this works. So again, if you have any questions, I probably have a slide for it, and we can talk about it. So the first thing I want to talk about is, so in January, I'm Los Angeles based. I think a lot of people here are Los Angeles based. In January, of course, we had some really horrible fires. And a lot of people in the community, in the film community, sort of helped out, did what they can. But I just want to point to something that I don't think many people know about, and it hasn't really been publicized, and that is Aputure had 100 EcoFlow deltas, and we're gonna give them out to the community. And so they literally donated 100 of them to help the effort and help the residents in Los Angeles. And they're still out there right now with people who are suffering greatly. And they basically gave them the toy box rentals to manage the distribution, and then eventually, maybe a year or two down the road, the return back. So I just want to point that out, because that's huge. That's a really big deal, and it really made a big impact to a lot of people that lost power for a very long time and are still using them today. So the virtual production glossary, if there's a QR code here if you want to grab it, or the address, but it sort of the Bible, the ASC manual, if you will, of virtual production. It was written by Noah Cadner, who is also our editor of virtual production at American Cinematographer. And this is sort of the definition of virtual production, which is a really new term. It wasn't called virtual production 5 years ago. It was just called production. But this is, there you go. It's the combination of these things in order to create our images. The virtual production has been around for a very long time. You can see James Bond here on a rear screen projection. More recently, television shows have been using rear screen as well as a way to shoot process on stage. And rear screen is still being used as a very cheap way to shoot process. And I would say probably most, if not almost all, of the car process that you see on television nowadays, and probably most features as well, is actually process. Whether it's probably most of it's LED walls now, but it's very rare to go on a insert car anymore. This is a combination of LED panels to do the interactive lighting, combining LED panels for the lighting and rear screen for the imagery, which sort of took things to a new level. And all this was made possible because of these new laser projectors that have come out in the last few years, or last decade or two, that made rear screen much better because it was brighter, higher contrast, that sort of thing. But that's enough about rear screen. So virtual production as we know it today has sort of evolved over the last 5-10 years, with Rogue One there, shot by Greg Fraser, where they used big panels. They didn't really shoot the panels. They were very low sort of resolution, but they used them in the cockpit of whatever the spaceship was to get the interactive lighting of jumping to warp speed, that sort of thing. Mindhunter then is, we call that rich man's process, because David prefers to control every single detail about the final image that's on screen. So what they do is they put panels around the outside and play the video feed on that for the interactive lighting on the actors. But then they also do a composite on blue screen or green screen of the image that the camera sees, so he can have that final control over motion and composition and timing and that sort of thing. Now, of course, a lot of process is done with full-on walls, like we have over on the Fuse stage, where we have the panels that are above for the lighting, and then the panels that are being captured by the taking camera in order to do everything in camera at the same time. This is a simulcam setup. This is a while ago. This is sort of the very first iteration of virtual production as we know it today, where the sets would have green screens on them, and then they would have an engine that would drive sort of rough comps, through the taking camera. So you could get a preview of what it looked like, but you still had the final comp done later, which is actually nice in some ways because some directors don't like to make up their minds, or there's not enough time to fully develop whatever the load is going to be, whatever the environment you're going to build is. So you have that time in post to then go and actually fully further develop that iteration, and then make it into the final composition over the green screen. So it's still a valid technique today. And the cameras are tracked. It works very much similar to the LED volumes that we know today. It's just you're kicking the can down the road for the final comp in camera. There's also a lot of things that now where you're feeding video to the viewfinder of your camera so that your camera operator knows to tilt up to the monster. They know how high the monster is, There's also iPad apps and things like that where you can load in CG elements, and then you can walk around and see, exactly where it's going to be in real time and in real space. There's a lot of development going on towards that stuff. This is actually the view stage in Tampa. And this is sort of everything coming all together, camera tracking and in-camera visual effects and everything else to create the final image all at once. But I think we all know what that is. So here's sort of the components that go into this machine, and I like to talk about this because this is really, really hard. There's 100 different components back there made by a couple dozen different companies, and we're barely pulling off this magic trick. Even ILM is barely pulling off this magic trick with the very best hardware, the very best experts, and that sort of thing. So the reason why I like to talk about the machine is because when you go into a virtual production shoot, you want to be able to identify the components and how everything's working in order to sort of evaluate the facility that you're shooting with and how you're going to be successful. Because if any of those components aren't performing at the very highest level, you start to have problems. So basically what happens is you have the primary engine is running on a machine, on a computer, and then you have these render engines. So the render engines are getting instructions from the main primary PC through the engine operator, the person clicking the buttons, and it's sending the information out to those render nodes, which each one of those render nodes is then therefore attached to one part of the wall through this very important component right here called the LED processor. So the computer generates information, says, here's what you're going to display. Then the LED processor tells all of these panels how each pixel is going to work, what color each pixel is going to be. And usually, let's say a volume like this, there's probably 6 to 8 different render nodes back there, 6 to 8 LED processors, and all of those have to be working at the exact same time. So everything on the stage is gen-locked together. Everybody knows here what gen-lock is? No, some people might not. So gen-lock is basically, it's a clock. So it's running at the same rate as the taking camera, so 24 frames per second, or if you go off speed, it'll run at a different. But basically every single piece of hardware on a stage like this is all tied into that clock, so everything is starting at the exact same moment in time. And if that's not the case, if something is not right with gen-lock or something's not gen-locked, it'll be slightly off from everything else, and then you'll have all sorts of weird things happening. And then camera trackers. We don't actually have any camera trackers in here today, but obviously what happens is as the camera is moving through this three-dimensional space, all that information has to be transferred to the main computer in the game engine so that that knows how to display the proper imagery on the wall. There's two different types of camera tracking. There's outside in and inside out. Outside in is, as you've probably seen, if anybody's looked at behind the scenes photos of The Mandalorian, there's a bunch of cameras around the outside, and those are looking towards infrared tracker that's on the camera. Inside out is basically the inverse of that. You have a camera that's mounted to the taking camera, and that it looks up into a constellation of stars, which you can see all these stickers up in here. And that's sending infrared signal up to, or infrared light up to the stars. The stars are reflecting back to the little camera mounted on top of our camera. And then it's figuring out where it is in space based upon all of those stickers. There's pros and cons to both of them. Generally, outside in is more accurate, but you have a bunch of cameras that you have to paint out. So that's the other thing to consider. Especially if you have reflective objects on your shoot, then that might not be the best thing to do. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into these panels. Very important things. I'm going to sort of blow through this so we can get to lighting things. But let's say it's fair to say that, you know, when you're evaluating like a camera that you want to use, and you want to shoot with a 4K camera, well, 4K is one of the aspects to consider of your camera. You also have lots of other things to consider as well, and the same thing goes for panels. Like these, in engineering, you have to make compromises. Like we're going to go for, you know, the best color quality and the best scan rate, or there's more affordable panels meant for rock and roll and that sort of thing. And again, virtual production is really hard and is really demanding on the equipment. So a lot of these factors are very important in considering if a panel is suitable for virtual production. There's lots of different sizes of volumes. This is my first volume, which was, that sounds like a toy volume. But this is just a 12 by 20 wall. That was the only wall that was actually could be used on camera, the only one that was high enough quality to actually be photographed. And then these panels over here and up on the ceiling, on the wall, those are just cheap rock and roll panels I had them bring in so that we get the interactive light on the environment. And that's what a volume is really all about. That's why we're here, is because we want this envelope of light all around us to put us into the world that we're shooting on the camera, as opposed to green screen, blue screen, where we're kind of guessing at best. So the idea is to capture it all in camera as much as possible, and to be as true to the CG elements or plates or whatever it is as you can with the lighting that's on your foreground. Again, this is view in Tampa, so this is a medium-sized volume. I would call this a medium-sized volume as well. And then you have the big boys like Amazon and the ILM volume, which is about 80 feet across, 82 feet wide, has these giant panels that are on chain motors that can come in and sort of close the circle. And you might notice this shape right here. That's actually really important. On Mando season 1, they built a perfect circle, and then they went inside to start shooting stuff, and they realized, oh, the sound bounces off of every single surface back into the center of the volume. So they actually rebuilt it for season 2 and gave it more of an egg shape like the Amazon volume is, so that it helped to mitigate that. But it doesn't entirely. There's still big sound issues when you're recording sound on the volume because there's so many hard surfaces that the sound is reflecting off of. So I always tell people, you know, if your sound mixer hasn't been on a volume ever and shot that, then when you're going out in the Scout, invite the sound mixer with you because they need to know about this stuff, because you can certainly add materials to mitigate the sound reflections, that sort of thing, but they need to know about that in advance. I'm not a sound person, but I like to be friendly to them. The question was, does the shape of the volume affect the image? And no. Basically, the game engine knows the shape of the engine, or sorry, the shape of the volume. You put that in there, and then it calculates all of the imagery to display properly. You can even bring in like a floating panel, you know. If you have a shot and you're like, oh, I see a floor out there, you can actually slide something in, tell the engine that that panel is there, and it will display the image properly, seamlessly with everything else that's going on. There's not many big volumes anymore. A lot of them have been torn down because they're very financially difficult to maintain. And also, the other thing too, bigger does not mean better. Basically, the way this stuff works is that when you see something that is in the virtual world that is at the surface of the physical wall, the scaling is 1-to-1. So something that is 1 foot by 1 foot, that in the virtual world, that is where the wall is in the virtual world, it will be 1 foot by 1 foot, and it'll display properly here. Anything that's inside of that will be too large. It's just like a first-person video game. When you walk up to a wall, it magnifies the wall. It doesn't no longer looks realistic, right? So the same thing happens here. This is basically a big TV, right? So getting back to the size of the volume, if you're shooting like a hospital operating room, which is 20 by 20 feet like that, you wouldn't want to shoot that at Amazon because your set has to be 82 by 80 in order for it to scale properly. So if you're shooting something that's small, you want to shoot on a small volume. The two are linked just like that. Does that make sense? What can go wrong? There's all sorts of things that can go wrong. Testing is really, really important because any panel that you look at by eye means absolutely nothing to the camera. You have to bring the camera in, and you have to look for all of these things that can happen. Every single one of these things that's on here, well, some things are not, but most everything that's on this list of things that can go wrong on a volume are only seen by a camera. So it's important to talk to your virtual production team at a facility, or if you're building something, to really, really go in and make sure that you test and look for all of these different things. Moir is something that's a lot of people talk about, and that is simply due to what we call the pixel pitch of the panels. So all of these little LED emitters that are in here, there's a little bit of space in between them. And that space is called the pixel pitch. And the smaller the pixel pitch, the less likely you will experience moire in a volume. The larger the pixel pitch, the more likely you are to experience moire. The industry standard panel right now is a 2.8 millimeter pixel pitch, so 2.8 millimeters in between each pixel. And that number has been coming down over the last few years. Good reasons and bad reasons why not to use a smaller pixel pitch, but you want to be at least a 2.8 or smaller in order to be doing virtual production and not have serious moire issues. Moire is also a fickle thing. A different lens, if you go in and say, my Venice looks great on here, on a Leica lens, but then I throw on something else, some other lens, your moire could be completely different. Panavision actually has developed recently lenses that are very resistant to moire, specifically for shooting on volumes, where they've done some things optically inside to make it very resistant to that. But you will have different results on different lenses, as you will different results on different cameras. Some people there's been a lot of chatter about you have to shoot large format on a volume, and that's not true. You can definitely shoot Super 35 sensors on there. But again, your moire will be different between a Super 35 sensor and a format. Again, testing, important. When things do go wrong, you turn the wall green or blue, and then you kick the can down the post. The problem with that is that you already spent all this money building an environment or shooting plates, and now if you have a problem and you have to turn it green or blue, now you're spending twice as much money since you have to do post-compositing. There's a lot of reasons to shoot on a volume, a lot of reasons not to shoot on a volume. I think I'm going to skip over all of this stuff. I would say that generally speaking, there are more reasons not to shoot on a volume than there are reasons to shoot on a volume, and it's a complex formula. This stuff is to shoot on a volume is pretty expensive, so you might not want to shoot like a very simple, intimate scene in an apartment building on a volume. Might not be the best use of money, but if you need to have endless sunset looking out over the water, that would be a really great reason to shoot on a volume, because then you can do that all day long and all night long. So hard sunlight is really, really difficult to do on a volume because, well, first of all, hard sunlight is difficult to do on any set. You can't get the lights far enough away to act like a single source like the sun. So when you're in a volume like this, the same thing applies. So if I was going to come in here and try to do, a hard sunlight, I have a limited amount of space that beam angle will hit the set at. I have a very limited positions that I can actually put that light into. And then if I have to extend it over a wider part of the set, then I have to have multiple hard light sources, and now multiple shadows are an issue. So, generally speaking, unless you have a lot of stuff, if you're in the middle of a forest and you can sort of get away with it, then maybe that's okay. But generally speaking, just like the real world, just like on sets and blue screens and green screens, you have issues using hard light on a volume. The other thing too is that the extremely high contrast relates to this. So these panels all panels are susceptible to what we call flashing, which is basically when a source of light bounces off of something and onto the panels, it washes out the panels. So your blacks are now gray. So you'll see like everything in here has a control grid on it. And that's specifically so that we can minimize the amount of light that's hitting the wall and therefore reducing our contrast. That also applies not only to our lights, it also applies to the content that's on the wall. If we have, say, a space field, and we have stars over black, and then we have a moon over here, the moon's going to wash out all of the black. So extremely high contrast environments might also not be suitable for our volume. As a matter of fact, there's a very big movie right now that just shot that's set in space. Greg Fraser shot it. And of course, Greg Fraser is a huge advocate of LED volumes and that sort of thing. And they shot none of the space stuff, as far as I know, on a volume, I'm sure in large part because of that issue. Pre-production, that's an important one. So if you're going in and you're building an Unreal load, it takes a lot of time and a lot of thought in order to do that. Me personally, I work in, I didn't even introduce myself. I work in episodic television a lot, sometimes films, commercials, that sort of thing. But I've never had less than 8 weeks to build for a load to be built. And the first movie that I did, it was much more than that. It was 12, 16 weeks, I think, something like that. And that was even a very small budget film. So, but you just have to have that much lead time for the artists to create these environments and for you to work with them to develop them through the iterations that you need to in order to get to the final imagery. So if you don't have that sort of lead time to go into a full Unreal environment, you're again, if things don't look well on the shoot day, now you're going to spend twice as much money because you're fixing them in post. So that's really important for producers to understand when going into a full CG environment, is that you have to have this lead time and you have to have engage your cinematographer and your production designer immediately from the very beginning, because everybody's working to develop this. And this is, by the way, this is no different than the real world. And that's something that I want to keep coming back to here, because this is really intimidating coming in here and shooting on a stage like this. And but it's kind of pretty much the same as what we actually do. It's just a different sort of timeline almost. When you're going in, you're building a virtual environment, you're building sets, you're lighting the sets, you're putting actors in them, and you're shooting them with a camera. That's it. It's just a different way of thinking about it, But when I start a TV show, I go in 12 weeks beforehand, and I sit down with the production designer, and we start building the sets and the concepts and that sort of thing. And so it's the same thing. It's just there's a lot less involved. The cinematographer and production designer should be there from the very beginning. It's very important. What happens with the production designer on a show or a movie, whatever, it's the production designer of the entire production that drives what's being done by the virtual art department. So the two work side by side, but it's the production designer who's driving the mere virtual world art department and telling them what to do, what the sets are going to look like, the materials, that sort of thing, the set deck, all of it. And so it's important for those two to be working together from the very beginning. The assets that you put into a load, there's sort of really three different kinds. There's full CG things that you can put in there. So like if you have a spaceship going across, that spaceship probably doesn't exist in real life, so that's going to be a full CG creation. Photogrammetry and LiDAR scanning, and also now G-Splat as well. Those are things where you are actually sort of scanning real-world art in items. Like you can take this motorcycle, you can scan it with photogrammetry or G-Spots or whatever, and you can put them into the load. And then what you've done now is you've taken a real asset that exists in real life, and you've put it into the virtual world, so it's real. It's like a photo basically, but in the virtual world. So that's going to be your best results for actually making things look photorealistic on the wall. The other thing too is there are these marketplaces, these websites that you can go to. Epic Games owns one or two of them, and there's a few others where you can build stuff, you can buy things. You can even buy entire loads if you want to, and then you sort of modify them to suit whatever it is that you're shooting. Probably it's not the best generally because you don't know where the stuff is coming from, who built it, what its quality is going to be. So, your mileage will vary there as far as getting stuff from marketplaces and putting it into there. And again, testing is very important. When you put something on a wall, be it a photographic plate that you shot or a CG world, an Unreal environment, whatever, the wall never makes things look better. The wall always makes things look worse. If you look at it on your computer like, oh, this looks amazing, and then you put it on here and blow it up to this, it will never look as good as what it looked like on your computer, right? You see every tiny little problem. So again, you got to make sure that you check out what it actually looks like on here before your shoot day. Yeah. Well, LiDAR is different than G-splats. So who here is familiar with Gaussian splats or G-splats? Okay, so basically, photogrammetry is basically a technique where we're scanning this bike, right? So we go around the bike and we're shooting, dozens, hundreds of photos of the bike from every single angle that you possibly can, going all around it, catching all the real-world reflections, that sort of thing. And then you put it into a computer, and a bunch of visual effects artists work on it, and they basically put all those photographs together into a 3D model of the bike, right? And you can combine that with a LiDAR scan. If we scan the bike with LiDAR, it creates a 3D model of the bike using lasers. So if you build the bike in 3D and then cover it with a skin that's photogrammetry, then you've created a very photoreal virtual 3D asset that you can put into the wall. G-splats, Gaussian splats, it's an emerging technology. It's still at the very, very beginning, but basically Gaussian splats are a fancy version of photogrammetry. Basically, you still do the same thing. You take a bunch of photos of the bike, but then you put it into a tool that sort of assembles them in a more automatic way than the very labor-intensive with visual effects artists photogrammetry method. But the results are kind of get to the same place eventually. The camera for photogrammetry, when you're shooting things that are meant to be photorealistic on the wall, whether it's plates for static images, whether it's driving plates for process, whether it's photogrammetry, you want to use high quality cameras. If you go out and you shoot something with a GoPro or a DSLR and then blow it up to this large, well, guess what? Again, the same problem. You're going to see every single tiny little flaw if it's not 10-bit video and high resolution, high dynamic range, and all those sorts of things. You will start to have issues ranging from small issues to giant issues. So that sort of thing. I can't call out any specific camera that you have to shoot with this, but the higher the quality camera, the better your results will be. There's another company I work with who has been doing a lot of G-splat stuff, and basically their solution is, in part because they own it, but they have a Komodo, and they basically set the Komodo to time-lapse mode, and he just sort of walks through an environment, and it's set to take a photo every second or 2 seconds, something like that. So as he's walking through, shooting from every different angle, the Komodo's catching it. It's a high resolution, high dynamic range, high quality, high bit depth, low compression image that then generates really great results that when we throw on the wall, it all holds up pretty well. Virtual scouting is a thing that some people do now in Unreal. So here we go. Working with lighting, virtual lighting. So this is really important. The engine, I don't know, a few decades ago or so, there's these principles called global illumination and ray tracing. What that means is basically computer graphics, basically they figured out how to trace every little ray of light that's hitting this bike. Let's say there was a sun on it, the sun comes down, it bounces off of the leather, which then sort of kicks off the floor, and if there's something over here, a tiny little bit of that light then has made it all the way over here. That's called ray tracing and global illumination. And so what that did is it created a really, really good photorealistic CG graphics because it was all about the light. It's all about where the light's going, how it's interacting with the virtual elements, and then making it look like it's the real world because light bounces around or doesn't. And so the computers were able to figure that out. The engine does the same thing now, but in real time. Backlighting versus dynamics, and Lumen. Lumen is a big thing that came out in Unreal a few versions ago. With Lumen inside of Unreal, you can basically change anything at any time. It doesn't matter. You can change objects, you can change lighting, you can do it all right there on the day without having to re-render. I don't personally feel that Lumen makes things look better. I kind of think that baking makes things look better, but you don't have the flexibility of doing that, the flexibility of changing everything that you want to. Also, it's much more expensive from a bandwidth point of view to be able to change anything at any time as opposed to baking things in. If you don't, again, have the very best components in computers and stuff like that, and everything is sort of not baked and can do anything anytime, that gets very costly for the computers to process all of that. And so then you start to have diminishing results. And yes, you can do interactive lighting effects. Like this load right here, this is from Muppets Haunted Mansion that I shot. We had this fireplace going all the time, and it sort of created we had the flicker effects happening in the real world. And you can see this is where we started on Haunted Mansion, right here. This is the very first version that I got from the artists. And you can see we took it in a very different direction over the course of several weeks. So again, that's why it's very important to involve your cinematographer from the very beginning, because what the artists are doing may not be what you actually want the film to look like. I would highly recommend, if you're getting into building a load, sit down with the visual effects artist and figure out what the lights can do, because the lights in the virtual world fundamentally work like our lights in the real world. You have hard light, you have soft light, that sort of thing. But the fun thing is that you can totally defy physics. You can create a 100 by 100 softbox overhead and then make it invisible. You can have a Fresnel that's right here, and you can say, I want it to hit the bike, but I don't want it to hit anything beyond here. So without using flags and nets and things like that, you can do these really fun things that defy physics in the virtual world, and it's great to know about them ahead of time. So lighting on set, what you do in the virtual world, this is going to sound obvious, but what you do in the virtual world you have to be able to do that in the physical world as well, because blending the wall and the foreground is the most important thing. So making sure that you are able to physically do what you need to do on the stage is imperative. We've already talked about flashing, light cards. Light cards are, you put up basically a flat CG element up into the wall, and because it's in the wall, it's emitting light. So you can use the wall itself to emit soft light. It will never emit hard light, of course, but if you want to say brighten up that area to cast some light on the foreground, that's what a light card is. You can also do the same thing, but make it negative as well, which you'll see later in just a bit. The engine can control DMX, and especially tomorrow, they're going to get into this more, but the engine can also drive pixel mapping. So like this Infinimat right here has about 16 different pixels built into it. So each one of those pixels, you can basically feed the video from your load into the Infinimat, and it's going to cast the same real-world light of the environment or the plate or whatever into here. And then if you're moving in particular, this mat right here, those pixels will respond to the video that it's been mapped to. So as the car's driving down the road, we're static here, but as the car is driving down the road, all of those pixels of video are being replicated within the Infinimat or the Fresnel or whatever it is that you have. But so the engine is driving the light and therefore creating a very realistic movement. So this is something I discovered on my first shoot, and I didn't realize. And we did a whole article in American Cinematographer about this issue. So all of these panels, none of these panels, well, very few panels today were actually designed with virtual production in mind. They were designed to make things look great to your eye and to cameras, for rock and roll, for commercial applications, for everything except virtual production, because that didn't exist. So the panel manufacturers, in order to make the panels look good with a video signal, they have 3 emitters in them, a red emitter, a green emitter, a blue emitter. And those emitters are very, very narrow bands. They generate a very, very saturated red, a green, and a blue. And what that does is when you look at it, that gives you the most color fidelity for an image when you look at it. The issue is that now that we're using these video panels to emit light onto the foregrounds, you're missing all sorts of color spectrum. So you see, this is a row panel. Row makes the panels that were in they're sort of what's being used in the biggest and the best volumes. But all panels have very similar characteristics to this. So this panel right here, as we measured it, you can see there's the blue, there's the green, there's the red, super peaky, and then this is the orbiter in the backgrounds. So our cinema lighting manufacturers, like Aputure, Arri, everybody, has been working for the last couple of, 10, 15 years that we've had LED lighting to fill out that spectrum and make it as high quality and as full as possible. And Tim Kang, who's circling around here tonight, has been instrumental across multiple efforts to increase the spectrum and the quality of LED lighting in order for it to reproduce better when you're actually lighting things on camera. So basically, all that information that you saw that's lacking in the spectrum of the light that's being emitted on the wall, particularly in cyan and orange, high-end red, low-end blues, if you don't have that being emitted onto your objects, the colors are going to shift. Particularly skin tone takes on this really weird sort of red, crabby type of characteristic, and skin tone is obviously the most important thing for us to reproduce naturally on camera. So what we do to sort of overcome some of the deficits of the lighting that's emitted from the wall is you fill them in with full spectrum lighting. And as you fill them in, LED panels put you in the room that you're, that's the virtual room, right? They set the stage. This is doing the heavy lifting of this is what our foreground looks like blended into the background. But then you bring in the full spectrum lighting in order to make things look better and then shape them, give them more contrast, that sort of thing. So this is a decent example of what it does. You can see all of their skin tones, they take on this really red characteristic. You can also see color shifts, particularly in warm objects. This is actually not as exaggerated on the wall here as it is in real life when you're shooting stuff, but you can see particularly warm stuff. Like it's really sensitive to that red emitter right there, and all the colors just sort of shift. So it's something to be very aware of when you're planning your virtual production shoot, and don't ever let a producer think that you don't have to bring in lights into a virtual production. You very much do for that reason and for a lot of different reasons. You still have to lighten the volume, like the title of the session. So here's the future, and this is another article that we did that's a follow-up that's in this January's issue of American Cinematographer, where we cover some of the new things that have been emerging to help us with this color rendition problem. So there we are, we're back on our RGB panels up there. We see the terrible skin tones, the colors shifting, and now we have mimics. Does everybody know what mimic is? Mimic is basically, it's basically a video tile in the form of a light. That's made by KinoFlow, and you can put the video of the environment, the plate, whatever, onto the mimic. You have full spectrum lighting that's coming back to you that is true to the environment, but better for the foreground subjects. Then beyond that, RGBW is the next step, and we're starting to add emitters to different panels, and then so that the panels are fuller spectrum. And RGBW is the first iteration of that. The next one is RGBCA. And that's where we're adding cyan and amber emitters. And again, just the exact same as what our cinema lighting manufacturers have done and have been figuring out over the last few years, is that the more you add these different emitters and blend them all together and fill out that spectrum, the better the color is for the foreground objects and also in some cases for the imagery. You can't shoot an RGBW panel because the white washes out the saturation, but the cyan and amber panels, you can. This is important. The only thing that matters is what the camera sees. You can walk onto a volume and that we've been working on for a while, and you're like, whoa, that looks crazy. But then you go over to the monitor and you're like, oh, but it's all blending together perfectly. And that's the only thing that matters. Nothing matters what it looks like to our eyes. It only matters what this thing is seeing. And again, testing is important. trust your instincts. Like I try to equate when I teach this class, everything goes back to the real world. We're putting cameras and lights together and we're shooting them and we have put actors onto a stage. There's really nothing fundamentally that different from what we do every single day at cinematographers, production designers. It's just a different way of thinking about it. If something doesn't look right, feel right, whatever, again, trust your instincts. Even though this is a big fancy machine that's sort of overwhelming when you go into your first shoot, if it doesn't feel right to you, ask why doesn't it feel right, and trust your instincts, and you'll be okay. Anyway, that's it. Let's light some stuff. All right, so we are in the desert, and let's go ahead and shut off all the lights, please. And let's bring Michelle and Jay out. Michelle and Jay were cruising down Route 66, and their bike broke down. Oh. There's all sorts of things, again, that you can do in Unreal. We're not in Unreal right now, we're in Assimilate, so it's a different way of working with stuff. We can't move around 3D objects, but we can still do some really interesting things. Like, let's change the sky. And so this is a 2D plate that we're working with right now. So, if we were working in Unreal, as the camera moves around, things sort of shift and move like they would in the real world. Like objects that are in the foreground are going to move faster than objects that are in the background, commonly referred to as the parallax movement that happens, and all of that's being generated by the engine based upon where the camera is that is being tracked in 3D space. All right, so there we go. We just changed the sky. Okay, I like this one better. This feels more desert to me. But let's move it around a little bit. Let's move the fireball a little oh, geez. A little camera right, please. We sort of set the stage of, okay, I want the hard light to hit the background in the virtual world, but I don't want it to come in here exactly, because again, we have that problem of it's hard to make hard light work really well here in the physical space, but it's okay in the background, and we can sort of allude to that to a little bit here in the foreground. But let's move the fireball further left, please. And we're going to kind of line it up with that streak. Oh, let's hold it there. That's okay. I think that's pretty accurate to recreate that streak. Let's turn that bar back on at the top. Great, thank you. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the environment to actually boost the reflections on here and emit more light onto the subjects. Let's increase the brightness on that. Let's double the brightness. And we're going to keep that bar just outside of camera so it works for us. Okay, can you go even brighter on it? Okay, so you see the panels are emitting more and more light and boosting reflections up. I feel like we have too much frontal light coming on over here, and also, hey Michelle, just stand up for me for a second. And you can see, because we have so much light coming from the panels over here, you can see her skin tone's already starting to go. So let's knock down this part of the load, like from about here all the way over there. Let's cut that intensity in half, please. So I'm just going to set the iris here for where I think the image looks pretty good on the wall, which we can always change, of course. Okay, that's pretty decent. I like that. And now I want to feel more light coming from this direction over here, since the heat in the sky is over here. So why don't we create a window in about this sound from about here to here, and we'll double the intensity on that. Let's rotate these signs so they're not flat to where there's no light, and let's rotate them so we get some reflections in them. So there's a lot of discussion in virtual production facilities over whether to build a ceiling or not, and there's pros and cons to that. If you're shooting something, things that are really reflective, like this bike has all these reflective elements over it, or say your lead character wears a mirror ball for a head, then you're gonna want to have a ceiling, because those reflections look super real on those reflective elements. Also, if you're shooting through stuff, through panes of glass or or glasses of liquids or whatever, the more of these dark areas that you can fill in, the ceiling out there, everything else, the better your reflections will be, which is one of the huge advantages of shooting on a volume. And so what I'm doing right now is by increasing the brightness of this, we're both emitting the environmental lighting onto the subjects, but also really boosting up the reflections on the bike at the same time. The downside of having a ceiling is that you don't have all these rigging points. So if you're not shooting stuff and the other downside too is that most ceilings are going to be RGB. So all of that light that's being emitted from the ceiling is going to be a real low quality light. Whereas if you come in here and you're using Infinimats to sort of build almost a ceiling out of fixtures, now you have very high quality light that's RGB WW or beyond that, that's full spectrum and that's coming down. And then if you're pixel mapping it to your ceiling made out of cinema lights, then now you have sort of the best of both worlds. You have the real virtual environment lighting going through your cinema lights and casting that in a very full spectrum way onto your foregrounds. So there's pros and cons to both. I would say there's probably a lot more pros to using Infinimats and other cinema lighting in order to build your ceiling out, because you still have all of these other points where you can hang other sources, or you can hang rigging for special effects, or whatever it is that you need to do. The one thing to consider though when you're planning your lighting plot is your tracking system though. It's very important to keep that in mind. If you're using outside in, so you have all these cameras over here, they need to be able to see where the taking camera is at any point in time. If you're going to cover your ceiling with Infinimats, and you have to work with the virtual production supervisor and the team in order to be able to ensure that you can create a constellation of these stickers within your lighting plot, so that you can, even on lights or on frames or whatever, just as long as it's not going to go to something like, oh, we're going to blow wind through the desert, so we're going to have big fans over here, and now it's blowing all of our frames up here and moving all the stickers around, then your tracking won't work anymore. So you just have to sort of think about these things in advance and remember that that's very, very important. Okay, so we've got that going on. Now, let's bring in some more foreground lighting. So again, since the heat is coming from over here, let's walk this in just a little bit, and then we're going to give it a nice warm color, say like, let's go with 3200. White balance, didn't talk about that, that's important. Again, since this is video, and these panels are everything is sort of calibrated for D65, so 6500 Kelvin-ish, and that's standard for all video. So that's the native color white balance of these panels. And one way you can verify what it is that your entire system is doing is you could put just a virtual white card up on the wall, and you can measure it with a meter. You can auto white balance your camera to it, and you'll see exactly what the camera wants and what the native is for the panels. But it's going to be around 6500 Kelvin, more or less. The other thing to consider too is heat changes things. So when you turn the wall on for the first time, you got to wait about a half hour or so for everything to warm up and come up to its proper temperature. Even the best panels will warm up cool off by a few hundred degrees over the course of that first half hour. And also, if you have a facility that gets, let's say the air conditioning breaks down, you can have, color problems all of a sudden appear in the panels. So it's very, very important to keep those things in mind. So what that also means to us is that if we're balancing our camera at 6500 to therefore be native and display the image as well as possible, that means that we have to consider our lights as well. Because if you're, obviously, if 6500 is the white point, that means that all of these cool blues that are up in the sky are going to be way up there, 10,000 plus degrees Kelvin. So you have to choose lights that are able to reach that sort of those higher end Kelvins if you're going to be shooting in an outside environment like this. So let's bring the Infinimat up, please, and let's set it to its highest white point. So you can see we're kind of in the zone. And hey, is Tim around? The new Blair engine that Aputure has developed, which incorporates a a UV emitter has now sort of blown the ceiling away of what we were able to do. Most cinema lighting fixtures can only get up to about 10, maybe 15,000, correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, 10's really the standard, right? But the new Blair engine that Tim and Aputure have developed can get up to 20,000 Kelvin. So that's a really compelling reason to start choosing fixtures that have that in mind, especially if you're doing daytime work on the stage. The thing about, you can change the white balance of the panels. That is definitely a thing that you can do. But the thing is that when you start changing the white balance and you start dropping it down, also at the same time, if you start dimming the panels down, just like LEDs and cinema lighting fixtures, the performance starts to decrease. And it's because these are optimized for D65, for 6500 Kelvin, as you start going down, because they're dimming with pulse width modification, the color starts to shift. And eventually, at a certain point, emitters start to drop out because you can no longer generate that color. So for both the reason of color reproduction, both color temperature and intensity, you want to generally aim towards running your panels really bright, NDing the camera down if you need to, and also running them close to 6500. If you start to bring them down, you're not really going to have problems if you bring them down to, like, say 4300 or somewhere in there. But if you start trying to run your color balance on your panels at like 3200, you're going to start to see weird stuff. So all important things to keep in mind, again, because we have to make sure that our lighting that we're planning, both in the virtual and the physical world, is working with the limitations of the hardware of the panels in order for everything to blend together. So we have this, we have a warmer light coming that's sort of mimicking what the sun is going to do up there, and a soft source because it's, I intentionally chose not to have hard light coming in here. I chose indirect light. If you notice when you watch Mando, anytime they're on a volume, it's always like sunset. Like the mountain is just, the sun has just gone over the mountain. There's a reason for that. I'm gonna close down a little bit, but I think I like what that's doing. I noticed that it might be sort of a little bit of green in that sun over there. So let's add like 5 points of green to the 4x4. Copy. Oh, I love this. So by rotating these signs around, you can see that now we're getting real world reflections in the signs. That's one of the coolest things about virtual production are the reflections. One of the hardest things to do in a volume is to light this, and it's the same for blue screen, green screen, is to light things that are close to the wall. So what we've done is we've hung a bunch of lights that are specifically sort of meant to increase the light in this area. Some things you can do with light cards as well to sort of boost that area. But the other thing to consider when you're using light cards is that we have that problem again of emitting light sort of everywhere, and we're blowing out the contrast and milking out the blacks in other areas. We're kind of getting away with it a lot more here because it's daytime environment, but if it was a nighttime environment, I wouldn't use any light cards at all just to maintain our blacks. We hung a bunch of novas at the top of the wall. Why don't we turn those on to say 10% or so? And double it again. Hey, let's go full up and see what happens. All right. Now that's too much, so let's bring them back down. Let's do this. Let's leave this one back here. Let's leave that at where it is, but let's drop this one down by say 25 points. Just like I would in the real world, if I was out in the desert, I'm looking at the environment, I'm looking at the load, seeing what the lighting is in there, and I'm basically just letting that inform me as to what I should be doing to the foreground. So I can see that the light's drifting off. Again, the heat's over on the right, it drifts off over here on the left, so we can kind of recreate that a little bit with our cinema lighting. We don't have a really good match on the color, and I don't think we have time to super dial that in, but maybe let's warm this Nova up by, let's take that to say 4300. So that's good for that one. Let's go 10,000 on this one, please. While we're lighting the foregrounds, the engine operators are also going to go in here and they're going to tweak, in particular, this first little bit close to where the wall meets the environment. They're going to add little shaders and power windows and things like that to sort of help help that edge blend. So probably went too far on the warmth over here. Let's take that lamp back up to, like, say, 5600, please. And then Alex, why don't we do this? Why don't we add a little window, say in here, just to warm that little bit up and help that blend with the warm sand that we have in the foreground. So what they're going to do in Assimilate is they're going to sort of create a little power window right here. And since our real world sand is much warmer, both because of the light and the quality of it, it's just a whiter sand, then we're just going to warm that area up a little bit to help the blend. So now, Tony, let's also do this. So I see that there's this warmth over here in the virtual world that's from our sunlight, and I also feel a little bit of fall off from the dark hole over here on the bike. So why don't we take this unit here with the SoftBank and turn it on, and we'll give it sort of a bit of this somewhere between the cool and the warm to sort of simulate the light that would be coming from this direction on the bike. A little moire, yeah. Oh yeah, everybody see that? A little bit of color shift there. That's a type of moire. Now the way to fix moire is don't focus on the wall. There, gone. Moire is a physics problem. It's literally a matter of you have all these dots over here on the wall, you have all these dots on the sensor, and when the two don't quite align a certain way, that's when moire happens. You can't, once it's there, there's nothing you can do to get rid of it. So it's important to keep an eye on that. A lot of times what we'll do in here is we'll actually throw the load a little bit out of focus to give it a more realistic depth of field. Some systems can even calculate, that mountain is many hundreds of feet away, whereas that bush right there is much closer to the camera. So the mountain should be further out of focus than the bush would be. So we're just going to throw the wall just a little bit out of focus now. Yeah, let's call that. All right, let's go to the jungle set. One of the interesting reasons to shoot on volume is you can go from Joshua Tree to South America in a matter of minutes. We can kill the novas at the top of the wall in the desert. And now looking at this, so when Alex and I built this load, we again chose, knowing where we were going to be shooting this, we chose to bring the sun in from this direction because I knew that we'd be able to do that here and make it so that we can just point the camera this way, turn this light around, and sort of emulate what's going on over there. So let's bring the max minus around and base somewhere in this zone, and we'll reproduce that quality of light going left to right. So the question is, what T-stop? So basically, to avoid moire, depth of field is your friend on a stage. So, a lot of people try to shoot fairly as wide open as possible. It's a little counterintuitive because we want the wall to be really bright so it performs really well, but we want the T-stop to be really wide open so that we are more resistant to moire. So when I'm shooting on a volume, I'm almost always carrying like an N6 inside the camera so I can keep it nice and wide open. And again, some lenses are friendlier than others when it comes to shooting on a volume. Some people, you can shoot spherical, no problem. Some people, are adamant, no, you have to shoot anamorphic on the wall. And that's because the way anamorphic works is, on a spherical lens, you have your depth of field, 1/3 of the depth of field range is in front of the focus plane, and 2/3 is behind. And as far as sharpness goes, in anamorphic, that's flipped. So things fall out of focus faster in anamorphic. So it is, a little friendlier, but by no means do you have to limit yourself to anamorphic lenses. Spherical are fine. Now, the one thing to consider when you're choosing large format or Super 35 is that a lot of the large format glass out there is much slower than Super 35 glass. So if I'm shooting with some Luxes, which are 1.4, and then I go to a large format glass that's a 2.8 or even worse, that's something to consider, because even though it's a large format sensor, so in theory, because your field of view is different on a large format sensor, things fall off more quickly as far as the same shot size would be, but than a Super 35 glass. But if you're on a lens that's a 2.8 versus a lens that's a 1.4 in Super 35, your depth of field is going to be less with the 1.4 lens. So again, you don't have to shoot large format like some people are inclined to believe, but you do have to be aware of these issues. The other thing too is that if you're working on smaller pixel pitch cameras, like my first movie was shot on a wall that was a 1.5 millimeter pixel pitch. I could not make that wall moire at all, no matter what camera I tested on it, lenses, whatever. And we had, which is great because we actually had tons of stuff where we needed to focus on the wall. So that was a very good quality of those panels. The problem is that everything else about those panels sucked. So we had all sorts of problems. We had flicker, we had rolling we had scan lines, we had, they were SDR instead of HDR. Like there was every single other thing that you could have go wrong on a panel, we had on that, except we couldn't make the moire. So again, like, you have to, think about multiple things when you're considering. Huh?
We got some better moire here.
Oh, we got some better moire. Cool. Okay, let's kill the Infinimat for a second, please, the 8x. Okay, cool. And now let's turn on the 4x, please. Okay, and that's 36. I would say let's let's drag it around a little more closer to the wall, please. Panavision VAs are a whole line of lenses. This modification they've done for shooting shooting on walls is it's just a modification. VAs are great spherical lenses. You can use them for just normal stuff. Talking about reflectivity of the panels, some panels are really reflective. Going back to that first movie that I did, you could hold a bounce card right here and you could see it reflected in the wall. But these panels are pretty anti-reflective. The standard like RAW AOTO panels that people are using in volumes, like they're very anti-reflective. So I would say you could pretty much hit it with like a flashlight and you won't see the reflection, but you would wash it out. So we're going to turn on this Infinimat up here and get a little more skylight in there. Yeah. Often I get asked, can you use filters in a volume? And yeah, absolutely. There's no reason why not to. You can also use haze. That's no problem as well. The only thing I caution against when using haze is that, again, it lifts the blacks. So you start to, you'll be lifting the blacks on the wall faster than you'll be lifting the blacks on the foreground. So your mileage will vary on whether haze is successful or not, because the foreground is contrastier than the wall is. And also because you have all this stray light and stuff. Looking at this by eye, we can see that our foreground here is way more contrasting than the background is, and we won't be able to get the screens that physically dark, especially because of all the light that's bouncing around as the foreground. So we want to lighten up the contrast in the foreground to hopefully match that a little bit better. Why are we shooting with the 144? And that's just purely for a reason.
Is that the shutter angle?
The shutter angle, yes, exactly.
Are you ghost frame?
Ghost frame is you can shoot multiple cameras on the volume. What most people do is basically, when you're working in Unreal or any game engine, you have what's called the frustum, and that's a part of the image that's being optimized by the computers to look as good as possible. And that frustum is tracked. So when I pan left, that window is moving with me. When I tilt up, or some people say pan up, that frame is moving with the camera wherever it goes. That's what the camera is actually physically shooting. Everything outside of the frustum is just for lighting. If you have two cameras in here, you basically have two frustums. And so you can't really shoot two cameras at the exact same thing, but you can definitely shoot two different things and have two different frustums. Now, if this camera is going to pan over into this camera, now you have a choice to make. And what happens is you basically give one of the frustums priority. So if the two collide, one of them takes dominance, and the other one disappears behind it. The other way that you can shoot multiple cameras on a volume is ghost frame or frame remapping, and that's where basically the imagery on the wall starts flickering at a very high rate, and you skinny the shutter up on the cameras, and they're all synced together and working and cooperating together. But what that does is basically every camera that you're shooting with winds up having its own individual image, its own individual frustum. because it's only shooting a very small moment in time. So you can shoot all around. You can have all sorts of, like Fox Sports has a multicam stage where they're using ghost frame to shoot multiple cameras of the sportscasters. It's kind of annoying to work in because in real life the wall starts to flicker to varying degrees, and there's some things you can do to counteract it. But there's two primary manufacturers of LED processors that are sort of suitable enough for virtual production. One of them is made by Megapixel, the other is made by Brompton. Both of them are great and do really wonderful things for us. If you walk into a facility and you see a Brompton or Megapixel processors, you're gonna know that's a really good indicator of whether that facility is sort of pretty high level and suitable for virtual production. But the Megapixel version of ghost framing, and ghost framing is actually a trademark of theirs, is much more pleasing to work in than the Brompton one, I have to say, which is just frame remapping. So that's something to consider if you're doing ghost framing. Ghost framing is still fairly experimental, I would say, and not many people are really doing it for a variety of reasons, but it can be done. The 1000C is ready. Okay, so that's doing pretty good things. The 4x. Let's turn on the larger Infinimat. Now, if I was actually rigging this stage for a real shoot, I would have way more Infinimats up here to really fill out the environment. Because you can see by having dark spaces up in here, we're getting shadow back here, which is especially problematic because this part of the real world is super important since this is where the blend happens between real and virtual. So if I was able to fill that in more with skylight instead of having that shadow area, which is a dead giveaway of where the blend is happening, that would be better. We're a little okay here because Alan's been able to put so much stuff out here. So it's everything's sort of blending in a little bit better, and it's not as big of a problem as if you're shooting a desert. Why don't we turn on the Nova 600s over here and see what they're doing, if they're helping us or not. Okay, let's cut those in half, and then let's cut the 8x8 in half, intensity-wise. The question is, how much do I look at things in real life versus on the monitor? And I would say that since I came up when film was dominant, and I was a gaffer first, I'm very, I guess, comfortable and used to standing next to the camera and judging things a lot more than I think probably younger generations are. But so I'll do more by eye just naturally because of who I am. But again, like I was saying before, the only thing that matters is what's in here. So that will only get you so far looking in real life. Another thing too about the panels is always make sure you have 10-bit video. 8-bit video is not good enough to shoot. So your content, whether it's driving plates, whether it's coming through an engine, whatever, if it's 8-bit, you're going to see banding and compression and all sorts of bad things. So that's very important to consider. Also too, if the best thing you can do is make sure that your panels and your entire flow from image generation to the panels is HDR, because these cameras need that range of light on the panels in order to reproduce the best way possible. All right, I think it looks pretty good. So let's do this. Let's go to our driving process. So this is a plate that's been generated. All of these have been generated by Alex Pierce of SimPlates, and these are all 3D environments that have been that they've basically created 2D plates out of. And then this is a 3D environment that he can drive in, that we can drive in. And the interesting thing about that is that we can create whatever route it is that we want. Unlike if we went out and shot driving plates, you're stuck to that. Here we have the ability to change things on the day, and we can also as if we're tracking our camera and we're moving all around, the environment will adjust to the camera move. Let's rotate our street so we're kind of more over here a little bit out of the yeah, there we go. Yeah. Can you get rid of the K-rail, Alan? Is that a big ask? So now you can see what's happening behind us is that our operators are adjusting the load, the height to match sort of the perspective of where the camera is. Okay, great. So you can see we have all these really great reflections in the bike. I think you need a passenger. Yeah. Michelle, would you mind hopping on the back? Okay. And so if Brandon was being safe and wearing a helmet, there would be a ton of great reflections on that, but he's not. So, but we're gonna boost up the exposure in this area over here, Alex. Let's create a window from the edge of the wall over to about here. Is this the diffusion filter? Do we put a filter in?
It has a satin one.
Okay. Let's pull that out, please. Actually, let's put in like an eighth. How about that? Cool. Yeah, let's call that good over there. Let's increase the saturation of that area, please. Because we've sort of washed it out by our exposure increase. What I'm doing here is basically because there's so much reflection happening in the bike, and because it's nighttime, and because they're wearing helmets in the scene, so we don't have to worry about skin tone as much. I'm just basically using the wall for the sole source of light in this because it's going to preserve all those reflections the best. If I start turning on some studio lights, let's turn the Infinimat on, please. Now you see that's not very real because that light's not moving. Now if we pixel map the light, then that movement of the plate in there, then that would be a cool thing to do potentially. And now look, like this looks really weird, right? Like that looks super crushed and contrasty and oversaturated to our eye, but in the monitor, that's the only thing that matters. Oh, wow. All right, we got to roll. Look at those reflections. Amazing. Could never do that on green screen. And if we were tracking focus to the camera, it's cool. You would actually see the focus shift on the wall at the same time. Yeah.
I'll take over the control.
So the question was, what percentage is captured in camera versus what needs to be fixed in post? It just varies, and it's something that you always have to accommodate for when you're budgeting, is that there will almost always need to be some fixes done in post.
Seems like it's minimal.
Hopefully it's minimal, yeah. You know, I've done projects where there's almost nothing being touched in post. But then there are some other projects that, especially when things go bad, you know, and then you have to go blue screen or green screen, you know, then that's then you know your expense is going up, you know, or sometimes there's a need to plan for that. Like the last movie I did, we had a shot that was down looking up, and you know we set it up in a way where I was hoping for the best, that we would be able to capture it in camera, but planning that might have to be something that we turn blue or green, and we set it up to the best of our abilities, and it just wasn't working because we were actually, with the imagery was fine, but what we were actually seeing was the faceting of the panels. Since these are all flat panels, there are certain lighting scenarios where you can actually see that flatness, and so it generates sort of lines. So we're like, all right, cool, turn it green. The other thing about green and blue is that you can track green or blue with the camera, so that you know you don't necessarily have to turn the whole thing green or blue, and you don't want to, because then you lose all your environmental lighting. You can put just tiny little blue screens or green screens up behind only the part that you need to composite, and then all the rest of your real world lighting and reflections are still existing. So the question is, I guess to summarize it, what lights are best for working in volume? And I'd say whatever light it is that you are comfortable working with for your particular application. And the secondary part was about Kino Flow mimics. And you know, mimics are a really interesting tool, and I think that there's some advantages there if you're doing process work with movement and stuff like that. It's also, there are a lot of complexities that can become involved. Like you have to have a megapixel processor in order to run Kino, in order to run mimics. And renting mimics or buying mimics is way more expensive than buying Sonolights. So there's no one tool that's like the best. It's like it just depends on what it is that you're doing.